Okay, so a number of you participated in a game known as a dollar auction, and you seem to have an interesting reaction to it. And I asked a follow-up question for a very specific reason. So, to go over it again, what is the dollar auction? And specifically, what does it have to do with policy or American politics? And why teach it in a government class? All good and appropriate questions. And we've gone over a little bit on the dollar auction in an earlier presentation. So, what is the dollar auction? There are a few variations of it, and it is essentially what's called a pay-to-play auction. So a pay-to-play auction simply means that every participant in the auction must pay a fee as part of the auction process. In this case, what this pay-to-play auction means is that all bidders who come to the table are making what's called binding bids. So in other words, whatever they bid, they pay, regardless of whether they win the auction or lose the auction. They still pay their highest bid or their bid commitment. So a number of you say, there are no auctions I know of where anyone in his or her right mind would do this. And when we'll actually see a number of applications for it. Sorry, I keep fiddling with this camera here. But there are actually a number of situations that resemble or are pay-to-play auctions. And some of the variations include, one, it's an auction between two people, and they're bidding back and forth. And so they're competitors, and whatever they commit, they bid, they commit. They have to pay it. So in this case, you would be auctioning a $1 bill. And so you have two players who both have to pay their highest bid amount regardless of whether or not they win the dollar, and the highest bidder wins the auction and wins the dollar. So strategies can vary, and some people start the bidding at $1 and then not $1, but start bidding at 1 penny and keep going up. And eventually, your goal is to win the auction, to win the dollar at a gain. So you don't, or at least not a loss. So you don't want to lose money on the dollar. But what happens is, because of the nature of an all-pay auction, is that you rationally would like to say, okay, I'm going to bid to this amount, and then I'm going to stop because I can't get the dollar at a gain anymore. However, the problem is, let's say you say, okay, my stop point's going to be 70 cents. So if we bid up to 70 cents, I'm not going any further because I'm willing to commit 70 cents. And if that's not going to win, then I don't want to do it. Okay. Problem with that is that you lose 70 cents, and your opponent, all your opponent has to do is bid 71 and walk home to a victory, and you're out 70 cents, and your opponent just won the dollar at a 29-cent profit. So some strategies call for a continued, that people haven't set a stop point, or a break point, so they keep going and going and going and going. And part of what happens is people go, and then all of a sudden, the bid hits 96 cents, 95 cents, 96 cents, 97 cents, 98 cents, 99, $1. So you've hit the dollar mark. So one of the two competitors has bid the exact amount being auctioned. There's no money gained. If you win on a dollar bet, there's no money lost. It's a break even. So basically what you've done is you've managed to pay to earn the same thing that you just paid. So it's exchanging $1 for $1. And you've had the experience, maybe the fun or the thrill of the auction, the thrill of the competition, but what you haven't had is any of the gain, which was your original goal. So, but you also could be on the hook because your partner, your competitor, is on the hook for 99 cents and says, well, wait a minute, if you win the dollar, then I'm going to be on the hook for 99 cents. So he said, I can't allow that to happen. I've gone this far. I have to push this person. So, okay, $1. So now I have elevated the auction to what would seem to be an irrational point. Because I essentially just bid $1 for $1, knowing full well that I am actually going to pay more than that's worth. So I'm going to actually go in the whole 1 cent, because then I can rationalize to myself, okay, well, I was at 99. So if I win at $1, that means I only lose 1 penny to win the dollar, whereas my partner loses $1. But your partner also might be goaded into the fact, oh, I can't believe that person's doing that. $1 too. And eventually what can happen is people believe they've sunk a cost. They're like, well, I've come this far. I got to keep going. I have to stick with the principle of this. I have to win. What happens is that the goal of the auction changes. It shifts. And it's not no longer is your goal winning the dollar at, a competitive price. Your goal is beating the other person. It's saving face. It's winning at all costs. And you might say, okay, yeah. But when you see a competition devolve like that, you have to ask yourself, is this face saving worth me committing the balance of X amount of resources and losing these resources? And maybe the answer is yes, it is. Maybe it's not. And then you have to reevaluate and ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? So what happens is that some people argue that rational decision making breaks down. People try to rationalize what they're doing, but the rational thing breaks down after you bid over the dollar. And what happens later is that you're fighting over concepts that go far away from your original goal. And it tells us that one of the things we have to do, or things we have to think about, is what is the lesson that we can learn about playing in a dollar auction. You can play this with lots of people. It's a nasty game, and it can get a lot of fights. A lot of fights. But this kind of game, it's not always a perfect analogy, but it can be helpful. You'll see a lot of economists look at it, as well as a number of people who deal with conflict resolution. So what are some practical applications that would help us explain why this is relevant to American government? Well, what we see is that in terms of conflict and some other situations, dollar auctions happen a lot more than we think. In terms of conflict, I can use 2 examples. And the first would be American involvement in the Vietnam War. And you can say, well, how might this reflect this kind of auction? When put in simpler terms, what we have in the Vietnam War is there's a country called North Vietnam and a country called South Vietnam. Those countries were split after World War II during, because they had been occupied by the Japanese. They had been a French colony. And the French wanted its colony back from the Japanese after the war. There were a group of Vietnamese who declared independence, led by Ho Chi Minh, who had drifted into the communist camp, or become a communist. And the United States was not willing to tolerate or support the spread of communism around the world at the time. And so it had made a firm commitment, a bid, if you will, in the larger game of world power, saying that the job of the United States was to resist the spread of communism wherever it wanted to spread. And this became known as the Truman Doctrine, where the United States would assist free peoples when they were resisting communism, and National Security Council Memo number 68, which said that the United States would, regardless of the economic, political, military value or interest in any zone, if communism was spreading there, the United States would show concerted effort to resist the spread of communism, therefore stemming the growth of communism and showing the Soviet Union, who the United States believed led all international communism, that it meant business, and trying to stop the growth of Soviet influence around the world. So in Vietnam, after the French left, the country was partitioned and elections were set. So what would happen is that there would be a pro-Western, pro-democratic state in South Vietnam. And there was a state in North Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh that was communist. The problem inherent was that the United States was trying to build a country in South Vietnam because the French were gone. They had left. The United States was taking over to try to help influence the growth of a pro-Western or pro-democratic regime in South Vietnam and give it political, economic, and military aid. One of the problems was the United States underestimated the power or the popularity of Ho Chi Minh to a degree. So Ho Chi Minh was known as a Vietnamese nationalist and had been so for many years before the French were beaten and forced out of Vietnam. So a number of Vietnamese didn't just see him as a communist, they saw him mostly as a Vietnamese nationalist, someone who wanted a free and independent Vietnam, and someone who had resisted the Japanese occupation and resisted the French occupation, and so they saw him as a patriot. The United States saw him as a communist, first and foremost. And the person the United States put in charge in South Vietnam was not necessarily welcomed by most Vietnamese as a true Vietnamese nationalist and patriot. He did not have nearly the popular support that Ho Chi Minh had. His name was Ngo Dinh Diem. Well, Diem didn't have that popularity. So the United States is backing this government. It's supporting this government, and ostensibly for the principle of supporting free peoples where they resist communists and stopping the spread of international communism, thwarting the Soviet Union, etc., etc. But what happens? The United States is really on the hook for doing a number of things, and I've got this here. I want to show you these goals. So the United States' goals in South Vietnam during the war is to defend South Vietnam and promote the government there, to help establish the government and the legitimacy of President Diem, to win the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam to support this government so it could truly be independent. Now, elections had been set where Vietnamese could choose this government in the South or this government in the North as the government of Vietnam, so basically Diem or Ho Chi Minh, and that's what the elections would decide. The United States canceled those elections after figuring out by a large margin that Ho Chi Minh would have won the elections. Of course, claiming that they would have been tampered and everything else, and I'm sure there would have been tampering, but Ho Chi Minh was much more popular. And so the United States cancels the elections, it backs this government, and eventually we have the start of the Vietnam War with conflict. You have a pro-northern faction in South Vietnam that's growing called the Viet Cong, who use counterinsurgency or insurgency tactics and guerrilla warfare in the South, attacking U.S. and Allied assets. And then after the Gulf of Tonkin, the United States is at war in South Vietnam. Then, you have the United States saying, how do we win this war and what do we do? And part of the goals included defending and promoting South Vietnamese government, establishing the legitimacy of the Diem government, winning the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam, counteracting the National Liberation Front and the People's Army of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army, and the Viet Cong, and their guerrilla tactics by using counterinsurgency tactics. To the North Vietnamese, they now have this struggle. They have to fight the war. So to them, their side of the war is to use their Viet Cong, their National Liberation Front, to convince people in the countryside of South Vietnam that the North is for them, to undercut the legitimacy of the government in South Vietnam, to win the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam. Notice that goal stands true for both. And to strike the army of the Republic of Vietnam, that's the South Vietnamese Army, and promote guerrilla resistance using the National Liberation Front or the Viet Cong. So what's happened here is that the United States has and the North Vietnamese are bidding in a dollar auction. This is conflict resolution being ramped up one step at a time. And each are bidding. Now, the United States has failed to do a few things. So when we talked earlier, I had said, walking into a dollar auction, a number of people might set up what they might call a break point or a walk point, which means that they'll bid up to a certain amount and then say, you know what, it's not worth me investing any more time. I've spent this much. Okay, I was willing to part with it. I took a shot. It didn't work. I'll eat this and I'll walk away. However, I said part of the thing that fuels the dollar auction is people believe they've sunk costs. They've gone this far. They have to keep going. You have to keep going. What happens in South Vietnam is that the United States, over a period of years, learns that most of the people of South Vietnam do not support the South Vietnamese government. And in fact, they change leaders multiple times. In fact, Diem himself is assassinated with the tacit knowledge of the Kennedy administration. Just weeks before Kennedy himself is assassinated in Dallas, Diem was assassinated. He lost the support of a number of people. The new leaders of South Vietnam don't last. There's multiple changes in leadership and coups. The army, the only thing that's keeping the army, their army intact, is the fact they're being paid and backed by basically U.S. military and economic aid. It's the United States that's fighting the war, or the brunt of it. As far as winning the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam, no, that didn't really happen. One, the government didn't really endear itself to them, and two, some of the American behavior in Vietnam, in a number of ways, really put off Vietnamese people. So, and this is not necessarily a conscious thing, but in reading memoirs and things, I know in a book called Vietnam Percy, put out by a veteran, Marine veteran, William Earhart. Earhart had mentioned how, as a young man, he's a 19-year-old Marine in Vietnam, and he had acted in a rather boorish way, in the city of Hanoi, which is, not Hanoi, but Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam. It's this place. There's lots of Americans. There's lots of South Vietnamese. There's our allies. And a number of, black market operations had turned up, helping to support some people. And a flood of American goods came in. He also had an exorbitant, an exacerbated rise in things like prostitution. And, this 19-year-old man's talking to women in a certain way, and one of his buddies, who's South Vietnamese, says, he gets very angry with him and says, you talk to us like we're children. You treat us like we're children. You talk to our women like they're all prostitutes. You make fun of our traditions. So no one had prepared them culturally to deal with some of these changes. So, for example, in Vietnam, a tradition, as a sign of respect between an older generation and a younger generation, was that you would see, say, an older man and a younger man walking down the street holding hands. This was not an amorous signal like it is in, you hear all the songs that we have in the United States over many years, Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, etc. They talk about holding hands with your sweetheart. Well, in Vietnam, that's not an amorous sign. That's a sign of respect between old generation, young generation. And you're a 19-year-old from Percy, Pennsylvania, and what do you think that means? You take that as a sign of amorous relationships, and it's an old man and a young man holding hands. So this is 1967, and you see that. This is something that an American in 1967 would wonder, hey, is this appropriate? Or, this doesn't seem right. We don't see this in the United States unless it's like, a granddad holding his 5-year-old grandson while crossing the street, that sort of thing. So you have a number of Americans reacting this way. The point I'm trying to make is that that kind of action did not help win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese. Additionally, the government didn't help. So what's happening is you also have the question that the United States needs to be asking is, can the United States expect its military to win the hearts and minds of South Vietnamese? So basically, is the United States using its army to win a war, its armed forces to win a war, or to carry out a political mission? And is it appropriate for the army to be expected to carry out said mission? Now, I know we've gone on into some minutiae here, but bear with me. The North Vietnamese keep playing, the Patriot card, Ho Chi Minh. What happens is that the United States continues to sort of double down on its commitment. Things go bad. We need more resources. The United States sends more. So between 1964 and 1968, the United States keeps escalating its involvement to the point where by 1968, the United States has reached the height of its draft calls and its involvement in Southeast Asia. You've got hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in South Vietnam by that point. And they're all fighting, they're engaged in this action. And the question ultimately becomes, how do we win this war? Are we winning? And what are we doing? And there were real concerns, especially in 1968. In 1968, during a ceasefire, the North Vietnamese instructed the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front as they called them, to simultaneously surprise attack all American outposts throughout Vietnam. It was one massive strike, catching them by surprise. And so at home, in American televisions, after a bunch of Americans just months before had been told the war is coming to an end, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And a few months later, they're watching, the American embassy, the Marine Guards at the American embassy in Saigon engaged in small arms fire, trying to hold off, Viet Cong attacks. Now, after this is called the Tet Offensive. Now, after the Tet Offensive, within a few months, the United States not only broke the back of the Viet Cong, but also regained way more territory than it had even before that point. A number of Americans were wondering, are we getting the whole truth? What's going on there? At the same time, in the White House, a number of President Johnson's advisors felt he wasn't getting good information. And one of them was Clark Clifford, who started wondering by asking some basic questions. How many more troops do we need? I keep asking the commanders, because the commander kept saying, I need more troops, I need more troops, I need more troops. That's a lot to ask for, and you're going to have to say, well, how many more do you need? What's your goal? Can we do that? When do you need them? And the other question is simply, is it time to leave? In other words, what Clifford found was that we're supporting a government that has no real support, and it does nothing to help themselves. That government was corrupt. I mean, some of the people leading it were corrupt, and they were not really making ardent strides to win the hearts and minds of Vietnamese. So the only thing that's keeping that government afloat is the fact the United States Army is there. The American money is floating into it, and American political will is supporting it. But that becomes something that changes. How many more troops does America have to commit? What is the goal here? What is our ultimate goal? Are we preserving this government? Are we winning hearts and minds? Are we, annihilating the People's Army of Vietnam? What is it? Can we actually accomplish that goal? When? What's our timetable? And when is it time to leave? And with these questions, it became difficult for the United States to answer them. Because what kept happening was the United States was willing to escalate alongside the North Vietnamese. Now, the North Vietnamese say, I don't have a choice. I want to hold Vietnam. Now, they could have backed off and said, okay, we'll be North Vietnam. We'll accept we're separate. Fine. But they kept escalating. The United States escalates again. North Vietnam escalates again. The United States escalates again. And what it becomes a a principle over for North Vietnam is for national unity under one boundary, under one leadership that's self-determined. The United States is saying, no, it's about stopping international communism. And then the question becomes, well, if we abandon this ally, what is it going to say to our other allies who call on us for help? If we abandon this country, what message will it send to the Soviets? It's about the principle and everything else. In other words, the United States never set its break point. When does it leave? What is it? What is the set of conditions that I need? What are the set of conditions that have to be met? How do we accept victory? What is victory? What's our timetable? When's the time to leave? Can we actually accomplish this? Those breakpoints never got set. So what we can see here is an analysis of, saying, oh man, this is a terrible thing. The United States keeps getting further and further embroiled in this. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Another conflict we could see this in is the First World War. So we have a number of countries that have grown competitive, especially over colonies, resources, and trade. And the system that had used to balance power pretty evenly between countries had broken down. And these countries went to an idea known as risk theory, where they would arm themselves to the hilt as a deterrent for war, and then build these large alliances, defensive alliances, basically saying, well, all these team of countries will be together immediately. It would escalate a war to a level that you don't want to attempt and use it as a deterrent. Well, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a number of wheels got set in motion, much so that within 1 month, Europe was at war and mobilizing millions of men to the front. You could say, well, it makes no sense to do that, to sacrifice that much money, that number of people, that territory, the lives, the risks, everything involved in the horrible, horrible enterprise. But they were playing a variant of this game where they keep escalating, one up, one up, one up, one up. And they're fairly evenly balanced. And so in this case, Germany thinks that the best way to attack or to take advantage of the situation is by using what's called its Schlieffen Plan, which is to attack very rapidly, very early, and knock France out of the war right away. So the Germans decided let's knock out France early on. But that requires us to march through Belgium, which is a neutral country. And we don't really have the right to do it. But we'll tell them that we're going to. And if they dare resist us, we'll treat them as an enemy. So one of the theories is that in this kind of a conflict, early offensive operations, like taking that initiative, preempting, usually gives a great advantage. In this case, it did for a short time, or a period of time. But what happens in this case is that in the end, Germany loses. And in fact, one of the things that helped get more people against that country, new combatants to fight it, was the violation of Belgian neutrality and the way it attacked France like it did. So in this case, what happened is it heightens the conflict. It escalates. Well, guess what? Now other countries have escalated. Well, now what happens is the war settles down on a boundary along the Western Front, fairly stable, from the English Channel all the way to the Alps. And the question becomes, what happens? What do? You can't outflank anyone. You're stuck. You've basically evenly allocated the same number of troops, roughly. Offensive operations yield devastating and massive casualties. You're losing lots and lots of people. So you need to resort to technology to find a new way. In other words, escalating the conflict yet another step, saying, well, we're willing to go this far. Are you? And the French and the English and the Americans will eventually match them and then heighten and then match. And same with these alliances. Okay, well, if you attack me, my allies will attack you. Well, if your allies attack this guy, well, what happens? Germany and Austria are allies. Austria wants to go after Serbia for supporting the assassin who killed the Austrian crown prince. Russia has an alliance with Serbia. France has an alliance with Russia, as does England, and Belgium is a neutral country. What happens is the Germans tell the Russians who want to help the Serbians, saying if Germany or Austria attacks Serbia, Russia will come in against Germany or Austria. Germany warns, if you attack Austria, then we will attack you. France warns, then we will attack Germany if you attack Russia, etc., etc., etc. And if Belgian neutrality is violated, England will come to the aid of Russia and France, and then later on the United States comes into the war on the side of England and France. So this is a type of escalation. There's no break point. There's no stop point. There's no saying, okay, let's wait. No, these chips keep getting thrown in the pot, and this conflict keeps escalating. Then, when you've got the war started and you're nestled down in the Western Front, how do we do this? Well, you escalate the war again. Let's use gas weapons. This might really turn the tide so we don't have the manpower. Well, okay, one side used gas weapons, the other side's going to use gas weapons. Okay, this side, okay, you use gas weapons? Well, I've invented even deadlier gas weapons. Well, we've invented deadlier gas weapons, etc., vice versa, keeps going and going and going and going. This kind of auction means that you've continued to, your original goal was one thing. Then it became about the principle of it, about saving face and about winning this conflict. Then it took on another quality. It became something else, a very destructive something else. And so here's two cases where there was no break point, there's no stop point or anything decided, but conflict in these two cases can be seen as simpler applications of the dollar auction, or where you might see something like that. Lobbying. You might not realize it, but lobbying can be considered very much a type of application of the dollar auction. And here's just a couple quick examples. So if you think about it, let's say you are, for the sake of argument, let's say you are a professional broadcast association. Let's say you are the National Association of Broadcasters, and you are very concerned about a new proposed regulation that would place a 15% public affairs requirement on all radio stations. So that means the Federal Communications Commission would be empowered to enforce a requirement that all radio stations that are federally licensed in the United States would have a mandatory 15% block of time of their broadcast day reserved for non-commercial programming. Meaning there's 15% of your airspace every day that could not be commercial programming. And to top it off, it has to be educational. So 15% of your broadcast day, every single day, would have to be educational, non-commercial programming. So you say, wow. And when they say broadcast day, they mean day, which means prime hours when people are awake. So you can't bury it between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., which is what radio stations do with that kind of thing in a lot of cases. And so after calculating how much of your broadcast day is going to be taken up by meeting this requirement, let's say you are a major broadcast company who is a member of the National Association of Broadcasters, but you own something like 200 stations across the country. And you say, 15% of the broadcast day for every one of my stations, which are all licensed 24 hours, means that I must dedicate roughly 3.6 hours a day to non-commercial educational fare. And I have to do it during the daytime hours. So I have to do it, or, broadcast day. I can't do it the late evening, the early morning stuff. So I have to do it sometime between, 7 a.m. and, 10 p.m. Well, if I'm a radio station of that kind, I run my station in shifts. right? I do the morning show, which is usually 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. I do my midday show, 10 a.m. to 2. I do my afternoon drive, 2 to 6. I do my evening show, 6 to 10. And then my later show, 10 to 2. And then my other show, 2 to 6. I run in 4-hour bursts of 6 different hosts through the day, right? 6 times 4 is 24 hours in the day. So I have to do it in some of my prime hours. So morning drive is the most popular because that's where your money is made, and afternoon drive is where your money's made as well. Maybe midday or evening, but those are also decent money makers depending. So what I've effectively been told is I have to surrender basically one of the shifts that's most valuable to me at that time, and I not only have to surrender to educational fare, I can't sell a single commercial when people are listening. I hate this regulation. Now, the reason I'm building this up is I want you to understand, if I'm a commercial broadcaster, I absolutely hate this potential regulation. Now, this isn't just some policy being passed by the FCC, a bureaucracy, and handed down to me. This is something that's being floated in Congress as a law, and the president has said if it passes, he'll sign it. So I can't rely on a veto, and I have to somehow lobby Congress to stop this legislation. So we know how the committee process works, and we know that there's lobbying. At the same time, let's say I am a group of state governors, a lobbying organization for state governors. And we think it's a great idea because it will help us position our states to have supplemental educational outreach for our citizens. We also have professional educators groups also supporting this, saying that this should be done by professional teachers and everything else. So we have, let's say, the National Education Association, right? The National Council of Parents and Teachers. We have a governor's lobby. A number of these lobbies are all in favor of it. And we have little National Association of Broadcasters, but a powerful lobby against it, and a few others. But let's say the real dogfight happens between the National Congress of Parents and Teachers and the National Association of Broadcasters. Okay, both of these organizations know that this is not going to be a walk in the park. There's going to be congressional opposition, and you need to get support. And one way they're going to do it is by lobbying. And that costs money and resources. And so these two organizations are going to spend a great deal of time and money and resources into promoting their bill or their side of the bill. The problem is, and why is this a dollar auction, is you keep escalating. You keep saying, well, they sponsored this or they donated this campaign. Well, I'll donate the same too, or I'll donate to more people. Oh, they spent this much time, I'll spend this much more, etc. You keep escalating and escalating and escalating. Now, what is it over? It's over the principle. Do I necessarily benefit financially from this? Well, yes, if I win. If I lose, no. And even when I win or lose, no matter whether what happens to me, I still have committed a great deal of resources that I cannot recoup. So let's say I'm the National Association of Broadcasters and the law goes against my wishes. So I lobby, I spend a lot of money, I work with a lot of Congress people, I do all the right things, or strategically as far as trying to get the lobby to work. I spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of money, I use a lot of resources, and I still lose. Okay, that means I've sunk costs. So maybe there was a period of time where I said, maybe there's a break point. How far can I go? Is this likely to succeed? Okay, I keep taking straw polls and the opposite side keeps increasing. So in the cases of lobbying, sometimes in lobbying, this is what happens. You also have lobbyist organizations that have to build, buildings and commit resources to continue lobbying, even if they lose. They're still lobbying. They don't stop lobbying just because they lost. So you keep going and you keep sinking that cost. Now, you can sometimes see it with public ballparks, as you have sides doing the same kind of thing, lobbying one way or the other, spend a lot of money one way or the other. Let's say there have been times where Major League Baseball teams have commissioned architects to do studies of how to build a new ballpark, and they've done the surveys and everything else, and that costs a lot of money up front, with no guarantee that you'll ever get public ballpark funding. Sides might, if this is put to a public vote, they may lobby one way or the other. They may create an organization to, put out information to the community and everything else that costs money. Whether you win or lose, you've still put out that money. And so even if you lose, even if you win, there's money you're not necessarily going to recoup. And if you lose, that's definitely money you're not going to recoup. So you've paid to enter that auction. You've paid to play, and you keep escalating the conflict. The same could go with applying for grants, which happens to a lot of state and local governments and schools and things. So let's say the federal government is giving out block grants of, say $50,000, for a 4-year program that would help students prepare for college, specifically their English and mathematics skills. And your school would really like that money. The problem is there's not much actually grant money out there. So that $50,000 is going to go to 10 schools across the country. 10 schools across the country. And it's a competitive grant program, so you have to write an application and everything else. Well, there's a lot of money that you spend in going through that process. And there's no guarantee you'll get it. And some schools will actually hire a professional team of grant writers and consultants to write the grant. And what they do is they spend a fee. They pay a fee to these consultants who specialize in writing grants, hoping that having this team of professional grant writers will land them the grant. And sometimes it works. A lot of times it doesn't work. And those schools have, in some cases, these schools might have spent $50,000 in total hiring grant writers to write a series of grants that maybe didn't, each grant might have been $50,000 or less. And so in the end, they might have spent a bunch of money to hire professional grant writers to get grants that they would have been better off just keeping their money, and instead of hiring the grant writer, just keeping their money and using that money towards a similar kind of program. Grant writing. Sometimes that can be the result. Not all the time. Sometimes. So you have some other applications of this too. If you're a baseball fan, every year there might be a few superstar Japanese baseball players who enter the market, meaning the free agent market for Major League Baseball teams to negotiate with. But they have a special auction, a bid auction. That's a sealed bid auction. So you put your number in an envelope. Now, as a way of preventing a massive exodus of talented Japanese baseball players, what they do is they say, okay, in order to negotiate with any one of our players, the winning team who earns the right to negotiate with them must pay a posting fee, which goes to our league for losing this valuable player. So in other words, before you even get a chance to negotiate with a player, you must win a closed bidding war against other teams. And you're not even paying money for the contract for the player. The player can still turn you down, but you've sunk that money. You've lost it. So whether you win or lose on the contract, you still had to pay the posting fee for the right to negotiate. So let's say there's 7 teams that submit bids. how much are you willing to bid to get this player? Well, let's say in the case of, I think it was Tanaka, I mean, they were asking a large bidding fee, and the Yankees won it. But, the Yankees were willing to outspend, so the Yankees got to pay that. Now, these teams got to pay their posting fees to negotiate with this player, and the player can still say no. So that would be another case of this kind of auction or this kind of application. And so ultimately, why bother with this kind of an exercise? And what is the lesson? The first question should be to play or not to play. One of the first lessons that people often draw from the dollar auction is that you don't play a dollar auction. So get out. Don't play it. Don't engage in that. Now, that might not always be realistic, because in another case, what will happen is that if your opponent realizes that your strategy is not to engage in dollar auctions, then your opponent runs home to a cakewalk by bidding, say, in a dollar auction 5 cents and winning 95 cents, or bidding a penny, knowing that you won't get engaged in a dollar auction. So you might need to set a break point. You might need to instead focus on your goal. And the minute your goal is no longer in sight, you're willing to walk, saying, okay, this is how much I'm willing to spend, I'm willing to walk away. But understanding that escalation can quickly get out of control. And when the argument becomes, well, it's just about the principle, it's just about this, it's just about that, and that's not why you got involved, then you need to think about, okay, what am I doing here, or what's going on? And you will see this played out in the political arena in a number of respects. And you'll see it played out in foreign policy. It's not always a perfect analogy. It's not always an exact science. But it is one way of understanding some types of conflict in politics and in policy making. And it's important, I think, that you understand that. So the dollar auction. One of the classic examples, if you're a fan of old movies, a movie that was, not that old because it was out when I was a kid. I remember seeing it, called War Games, where a hacker kid, hacks in and starts a computer simulation that might lead to nuclear war. But to spoil it for you, at the end, the computer learns and realizes that the only true lesson is not to play the game. And so that can be often a lesson in the dollar auction. So don't play the dollar auction. Extract yourself once you realize you're in a dollar auction. Or if you have to play, if you don't have an option, you have to bid, you have to play. Understanding a realistic break point, like when you're, the limit you're willing to commit, and then say, okay, that's enough. This is getting ridiculous. Or forcing your opponent maybe to a certain limit, saying, okay, I'm going to force my opponent to a certain point, and realizing I think my opponent will go this far, and with no intention of actually winning, but just pushing them to the limit. So the dollar auction, an important access point for understanding certain aspects of politics and policy, and we see state and local government, federal government, foreign policy, domestic policy, lobbying, all happens.